December 21st, 1979. Now, I'm talking with Mrs. Evelyn Chenkin? Chenkin. Chenkin. What's your address?
Of 24 Burley Gardens, Southgate, London N14, Nay Freeman.
Nay Freeman. Now, you've got a interesting story about what happened after the war, and I want you to just sort of tell us, sometime perhaps in the future we can go into some greater detail, but I want to get the sort of framework of exactly what happened. Now, first of all, what happened? I mean, how did you first hear of this? Who spoke to you? Who organised this?
I was a student at the School of Slavonic Studies. I was a student at the School of Slavonic Studies.
Yeah.
I wasn't allowed to do full-time art studies in London. I had to have a job. So the job that I was in had finished, and I was working for a few hours a day at the Best Inn in London. And I was given the job of filling in receipts for an appeal that had been made by Chief Rabbi Herzog when he came to England to appeal in the synagogues for funds in order to take from the convents and non-Jewish homes Jewish children who had been placed in them during the war. This was mainly in France. He was very concerned with France. He'd been to France and he'd seen the situation there. And he knew that there were still many children who had remained in their placements and had not been removed.
Yes, so...
well, I was, you see, I happened to be in the office at the time, and Diane Grunfeld, who was talking to me about this appeal, said, would you be willing to go to France? And I didn't think of all the complications or of the results of my immediate sort of reaction, and I said, yes, I'd go.
Now this, he spoke to you on behalf of whom?
Well, he spoke to me on behalf, really, of the Best Inn, or at least not officially on behalf of the Best Inn, because they couldn't officially send anybody unofficially to France. In other words, they were sending me as on a mission that they could not officially recognize.
But in which framework did you go? Who was your contact there?
Rabbi Swift of the Best Inn. Though I had no contact. He met me in France when I first arrived. He took me to the Consistoire Central, and from there onwards I was on my own.
Who paid you?
More or less. I was supposedly paid by London from the money that came through from England to France.
Well, which money now?
Well, the money that had been collected.
By Rabbi Herzog?
By Rabbi Herzog.
Out of that fund?
Well, I don't know. I never knew exactly where the money came from. I had contacts in France with whom I could or couldn't, as the case may be, contact, and they gave me money.
Who were the contacts in France?
Well, they were gentlemen, let's say probably businessmen, who had had money transferred from England to France. I assume that's who they were.
Private individuals?
Yes.
Do you know anything about these, who they were? Or what
Not really. They're very vague in my mind. They were so negligent in their actual passing over of the money, because very often I had no money at all and I was literally starving. And it was never the same person twice. People would phone me and say they'd got money for me, and they'd meet me in the kosher restaurant or somewhere like that and hand over the money. Or sometimes I was given money in England and I smuggled it from England to France.
The money from England came from somebody in the Best Inn? Mm-hmm. Did you meet anybody in France who was connected with this activity with this fund of Rabbi Herzog?
No. I know that he came over during the period that I was in France to Paris, and he had a meeting with the heads of the organisations, but that was only on his own behalf. He had nothing to do with me. In fact, I had nothing to do with anybody. I was non-existent. I was given by the Consistoire Central, gave me the attic at the Rue de la Victoire synagogue, which was actually the very, very top of the synagogue building. It was a decrepit room, but dusty, and they gave it to me for an office. And from then onwards, I started contacting the organisations who'd been concerned with the search for children.
And the money that came from England, that was to cover all your expenses?
That was to cover my expenses, but much more so the expenses of taking these children out. You see, in many cases, children There were children in France were in a peculiar situation. If they had no parents at all, they were pupilles de la nation. They belonged to the French nation. So they had been, in many cases, fostered out to people who literally fostered them for the sake of the money that they had from the government and refused to give these children up because they were a source of income. So I had to literally pay them until the amount that they saw in my hand was sufficient to compensate the amount that they were going to get from the government. Sometimes I managed to get false papers because if I could get a tutelage, that's to say get somebody to verify that they were a relative of the child and would accept responsibility for them. And I had to go to the town hall and the police and everything and get papers and affidavits which was sworn out that these people were blood relatives of the child. Then I could use these papers to get the children out. But in one or two cases, even where we had really genuine papers, the convents closed their doors, we couldn't get the children out.
Yeah, before I just want to get the sort of the financial matter out of the way that we began with. So in other words, you gave an account. Did you have to give an accounting of the money you spent?
Well, I was told to take so much for my living.
Yeah.
Which was the equivalent of about £8 a week.
Yeah, but about all these expenses.
But all the expenses I took from, I was trusted with every penny that came into my hands. They knew that whatever I had, I was completely trusted with. But there were, as I said, there were times when I had no money at all, and I ran up an account at the kosher restaurant in Paris, and then sometimes he wouldn't give me any more credit. I had no money.
Yeah, I'm not thinking so much about the person, but the expenses now.
Then sometimes I had to go begging for money, even for those expenses, begging to organisations in France just to lend me enough money.
You were in touch with them? You were getting money?
I never received money that I didn't pay back. Mm-hmm. I borrowed money occasionally.
And when you met these people who were giving you the money, these different people that you met, you tell them how much money you
they gave me the money and into my hands. And I kept an account myself of what I spent, but I was never asked for an account. I used to, if Rabbi Swift came over, or I went over to London 26 times. I mean, I would give sort of say, right, I received so much and I spent so much. And if I spent a lot of money on taking a child out, sometimes it's a question, you see, I mean, the rate of exchange was very, at the time was very beneficial to us because we were getting a very high rate for our pounds at the beginning anyway. And I would just pay until I got the child, literally. So there was never a question of how much I was allowed to spend. I just spent until I paid. I literally sort of spent as much money as would get the child for me.
On these 26 visits to England, you reported always to Rabbi Swift or to anybody else?
No, I either went to Rabbi Swift or Diane Grunfeld. Diane Lazarus held the purse strings, and if I was very short in London, if I needed money, I would tell him, in fact, that I have a letter to say that they still owed me, I think, about £150 by the time I came back to London, because if I was short, then I borrowed money from my parents.
Now, in the course of you were there for how long?
I was there from the day after Sukkot in 1946 to Erev Pesach in 1948.
How many children joined this? Have you any idea how many children?
Well, I was given 127 hard cases.
Well, you were given?
I was given by the organisations a list of 127 hard cases. Of those, I suppose I must have got out about 60 or 70 myself.
I see. You received a list from the organisation, and your job was to contact them and find out what
yes,
could be
I
done.
would go to, for example, Wietzo would have a child that they couldn't do anything with. I'd go to the Wietzo office, talk to the Secretary General, take one of their social assistants with me, and go my own way about it. Because they were tired. By the time I came, most of the organisations, the people who had been in charge of them, were tired. They'd had enough. They had no money. They'd undertaken the most colossal job of work. They'd hidden these children. They'd brought them back. They were housing them. I mean, in Jury-en-Alsace, for example, which was an éclaireur juif home, there was a Jewish scout movement. The children were all covered in sores. I mean, they were very, very badly nourished. There was a great shortage of food. There was a great shortage of heat. There was electricity was cut 2 or 3 times a week, so it meant that there was no heating at all, no light. There was only so much money. Food was terribly expensive, and a lot of the organisations didn't have kosher homes, and it was against the best principles to put children in treif homes, so we had to make the homes that they were in kosher. In other words, we sort of made basic kashrut in the homes that were not kosher, in order to justify the fact that we could take these children out and sort of put them into at least if not a sort of kosher as 100%, at least it was a modicum of kashrut. In other words, they were eating kosher meat, which was practically unobtainable. But anyway, food in those days, meat was a luxury. And life was very hard, and you must understand that throughout France there were nothing but children's homes. Every organisation had its own homes. And I had to put a child, for example, in a Mizrahi home because I got some money from Mizrahi, and I had to sign it on the dotted line that I put this child in a Mizrahi home once I got the child out. And their children were sleeping on the floor. I mean, they were sleeping on flour sacks on the floor. I mean, I don't think anybody who was, unless you were literally in the homes themselves, or on the, let's say, on the receiving end of all this, could possibly have realised that we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of orphans. And
your mission was to children. Some of these children were already in Jewish homes.
No. The children that I took out were children who were in convents, and children who were in Catholic homes, children who were in danger of being converted, children whose tutelage, whose parents, whose relations didn't want the responsibility of taking them out, of claiming their relationship with these children because they didn't want the responsibility of them, to persuade them to give me to transfer their tutelage to me so that I could use it to remove these children. So my job was to get as many children as I could back to being Jewish from being Catholic. It was as simple as that.
So you had, in other words, really a double job there. One was to get the children out,
and the other was to place them.
And the other was to place them.
But I never had any trouble of placing them. The trouble was getting them out. I'd always find somewhere to put them. But you were not allowed to take them out of the country. One child, the first child I took out was, we had permission in England for this child who had an aunt, her mother's sister lived in England. We had permission to bring her to England. And we also brought out many children. I brought over to England for a holiday and took them back again. But otherwise they were not allowed to go anywhere else. They were pupilles de la nation and they belonged to France. But many of my children went on Ariabet.
Ariabet.
A lot of them were on the Extras. Children I put in certain homes were on the Extras. People I worked with were on the Extras. A lot of the kids went to the camps, went from their homes to the camps. One whole home in Toulouse, one whole children's home went en masse from, which I've already reported, went en masse from the home to Marseille and Marseille to the Extras.
Have you remained in touch with any of them?
But after the first child and saying goodbye, I made myself a promise that if I became attached to every child, then I would have to stop. So when I said goodbye, it was goodbye. And funnily enough, I was at a meeting in Muswell Hill in London and talking to a group of young Witso girls about a very, I was talking actually about writing books. And I mentioned that I'd started writing because I had to get these stories out of my system, so I put them into children's stories. And the first girl I ever took out was a little girl called Lily Samuels. And one of the girls said, "Oh, do you know that she lived in Muswell Hill? She's gone to Australia with her 3 children." It was really rather marvellous. But
have you met some of them?
I've met no. Otherwise, I really don't know where they are. I'm sure many of them are here. I know that the first of my I had various secretaries, so-called secretaries at the time, people who helped me, either helped me sort of in my work. Don't forget, I had a great language difficulty when I first came. I was a student of Russian and Czech, not of French, and I had to really learn French when I arrived. I knew my French from school, but that was all. And so I did have help from, I had various éclaireurs girls or boys at the beginning to help me. And one of them, certainly a girl called Sarah Bolek, is definitely here. I mean, I hope she's still here because she came on the outlet. She married an Algerian in one of the Hachshara camps in France and came here. And I'm sure that many of the other children are here. In fact, I'm sure that most of them are here. I think this is why I walk around very often. And when I'm in Israel, I look around and I think to myself, well, I must have lots of children here because they must have had children of their own. You know, I must be grandmother to many children in Israel.
With which organizations, Jewish organizations, were you in touch in France?
There's a list.
Yes?
Yes. Actually, I think yes, but I don't know whether I've given you a copy of that or not. But I don't even know whether I've registered it, but I hope I have because it's important. Those were my glasses.
Oh dear.
There was the OC, Opège, Éclaireur, Vritzo. I think most of the organisations, a lot of the organisations had combined had combined with OSCE. L'Opège was a group of various organisations. There were the left-wing organisations as well, communist organisations who also had, Jewish communist organisations who also had their children's homes there. And it was, if I may go right back to when I first was associated with the Beth Din, there were children coming over from France to Marlow in Buckinghamshire.
To Marlow in Buckinghamshire, yeah.
And I remember a Rabbi Klerkofer, who was concerned with the Dutch refugee children, who said to me that he thought there might be some Jewish children amongst them. So on Sunday morning I took myself down to Marlow, and I spoke to the directress of the camp, who was very sympathetic, and she said there were Jewish children there. And I found them. I went round to all the huts asking if there were any Jewish children, and got them all together. I made a party for them, and it must have been early February of 1946, because it was Purim in March, and I made a Purim party for them. And those children I found again in one of the children's homes in France, and we had a most marvellous reunion together.
Did the Beth Din leave you, did you have a free hand in where you could place your children?
I had a free hand completely.
I mean, the Beth Din, you mentioned for communist homes.
No, you see, the thing is, if the child belonged to to an organisation, after all said and done, they were the organisation's responsibility. Where it was possible, like Ose, where Rabbi Swift was in touch with Dr. Job, who was the director of Ose at the time, it was he who persuaded him to sort of try and change the houses. But if a communist organisation had placed a child, and the child belonged to that organisation, I'm afraid I had no compunction in returning the child. I mean, after all, they had placed the child. If somebody else had placed the child, obviously I wasn't going to go and give the child back into an organisation that wasn't responsible for them in the first place.
These children had all been placed by organisations? None of them?
No, not all of them. Some of them had been. Now, I had an experiment. During the summer of 1947, I organised a search throughout France, throughout all the departments of France, right through all the town halls and the schools and the police and all sorts of things, to find out whether Jewish children had been placed in that area, and found children who had been placed by parents, by their families, and had never been recovered, and those children had never been found. So
then did you take action?
Then I took action immediately.
But could you take action on your own?
I did. I took action on my own. I had a lot of help from various lawyers in France.
Can you give me any names?
Maître Müller, Maître Weil. You know, I would go to them. And the one marvellous lawyer in Poitiers, whose name I can't remember, who went with me to a convent to try and get a child out. He wasn't Jewish, it's true, he was a communist and he was very anti-Catholic, but that didn't matter. He was a humanist rather than anything else, and he did everything in his power. Unfortunately, I did not get the child out. I got her out, she had convulsions, I had to put her back, leave her in Poitiers. And by the time I went back with a doctor and a lawyer, she'd been incarcerated back in the convent. That was that. But I did, on many occasions, go to lawyers and ask for advice, and where I could get papers, and then got my false papers and went back to wherever I had these children.
What was the legal basis? I mean, if you
The legal basis was to find a relative, a living relative who was a blood relative of the child, or if there wasn't one, create a situation.
What do you mean by create a situation?
Go to somebody and ask them if they would swear an affidavit.
But they were a relation? Uh-huh. I mean, it couldn't be done through an organ. You had to have a blood relation, otherwise the child could not be taken out. No.
You see, it was done in the beginning. The children were taken out by these are the children who were left behind, and there was very little I could do. You see, this was a situation I found. It was explained to me when I arrived there by the organizer. I've called a meeting of all the organizations, and as you can imagine, they must have thought this, sort of this rather immature young woman. And I was very old at the time, as you can imagine, coming from England, could hardly speak the language, but they were very sympathetic. And a couple of years ago, I met Madame Reich, who was the Secretary General of WITSO at the time, and I, sitting down to her, I was at the WITSO conference in Paris, and I said, I wanted to know the truth. Would it have made any difference if I'd come or not come? And she said that they were there, and they were stale, and they were tired, and I made them, I literally forced them into taking action where they wouldn't have taken action by badgering them. I used to go and drive them mad. If I thought that even though they said there was nothing that could be done, if I thought I could do something, I wouldn't not do it. It had to be done. And then if I wasn't successful, then at least I would have a clear conscience about it.
But they had been doing this activity before you arrived.
They had been doing this activity from the end of the war.
Yes. And these names that you received were additional names that they didn't have?
These were the names that they gave me were names of children that they couldn't do anything about.
Why couldn't they do anything about it?
Because people had got the tutelage of these children. Or they had refused to give them up.
And why could you do it that they couldn't?
Because I paid, in many cases.
Yeah, and they didn't?
They had no money. This is why the appeal was made in the first instant. Because it was abundantly clear that with money you could do things that you couldn't do without, and there wasn't any money in France. People, I used to write home to my friends and my family saying, you can't understand what it's like here. Unless you're people who lived on the black market, of course, had. But otherwise you went to people and you got potato parings or apple parings for food. And for us in England it was incomprehensible.
When you went to these Christian institutions, yes?
The only Christian institutions I went to were convents. Is that what you mean?
Yes. When you went to convents, were they all convents?
All the children who were in institutions were in convents.
Not in seminaries or...
No, I didn't have any boys.
No boys?
No.
You were only dealing with girls?
No, I didn't have any boys on my lists in seminaries. I only had girls in convents.
I see. So all those that you found were girls?
Yes, but all that I found weren't only in convents.
Yeah.
No, I took boys out. Got boys out. I have a list here, and I've got quite a few of the actual... Whatever is written in my memoirs there is just fact. There's no embroidery at all, except that. No embroidery.
Boys you found in private homes?
Yes, and girls I found in convents. But not that many, because a lot of the children, as I think we've known since for a long time, the convents got their kids very quickly baptised, and the ones that didn't give them up kept them. It was, I saw for myself, if I hadn't seen it, and I wrote immediately to June Slasnik, who was June Roston, a very close friend of mine, who actually came out to France while I was there, and I wrote and told her when I'd just come back from a convent that I was going back again, and I never did get the child out. Unless you actually see it happen, or it happened with your own experience, it is something that you don't understand. Or at least we couldn't, because first of all we didn't live in a Catholic country, and secondly because it was beyond our reasoning. So
when you went to these convents, the children had, in most cases, been baptised?
Oh yes,
they'd been baptised.
Oh, yes. In many of the homes, in private homes, they'd also been baptised. Or they were coming up for their confirmation. And if they were coming up for their confirmation, I had to act very quickly. Because once they were confirmed into the Catholic Church, even for psychologically, it was very difficult to remove the child.
I presume there were some children that didn't generally the children didn't want to be moved.
Now, there were children where the foster parents were bringing them up as Jewish children.
Yes?
Yes, those children, because I was so short of funds, I left under supervision. In other words, the local rabbi knew where they were, the police knew where they were. You see, in France, for example, you can't move unless you inform the police. This is how, in some cases, we knew where families were going to move, and we had to act before they moved. Because, for example, if a family were moving, say, from Paris to, let's say, Carcassonne, for example, they had to inform the police that they were moving. I don't know whether they do now, but they certainly did then. Now, if they are under supervision, and the rabbi or the local minister or somebody is in touch with those children, then they would inform them that this family was moving. So once I knew this was the case, and I knew that there was no danger, because maybe because, in most of the cases, because the families were not religious. So they were quite content to let the children grow up in their own religion. It's only when the Catholic, people who were Catholic wanted the children, the kids Catholics. I mean, after all, it was a great mitzvah for them.
Yeah. But I was asking about the children that didn't want to leave.
Very few children didn't want to. In fact, none of them. It was the most remarkable experience you can imagine. That, with the exception of this child at Poitiers, and then only because she was being persuaded that she was doing the wrong thing, did I ever have any difficulty in taking a child away. It was most uncanny. They all seemed to know instinctively that I wanted the best for them. It was, if I say that I never had a struggle with a child, ever. It's uncanny, but it's true.
I'm very surprised to hear that.
Absolutely true. In fact, one particular child said to me, I knew you would come for me. And I mean, this was a little girl of about 10 or 11, very mature, a child of very, very bright, brilliant parents. And came with me as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And, if I could, you see, if there were brothers or sisters who had been parted, I took the other child with me. But in many cases, the children were, a child had been in placement maybe for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years even. Seemed to have they seemed to sense that I had something for them. And
they had no attachment?
No. It was a very superficial attachment. And that, I suppose, in a way shows that people who had any real feelings for these children had given them back. Or they had, there were cases where the measles girl, which I also, by the way, found, and I also found the Valere boys who were the whole scandal, that came in the end to with their uncle. Finale boys.
Yes,
I found them.
Yes?
Yes. And they came to England afterwards. In fact, you'll find them in my list of things.
They're in this country.
Yes, they're in this country, yes. And so, probably I would be very interested to know if any of the children, and there's probably many of them here, would know from 30 years back that they had come from these homes and been put into children's homes. It's quite remarkable that one does remember what happens when one's very young. And they must have gone through terrific trauma, most of all these children. The mere fact that there's any normality is quite remarkable.
But you say that out of your original list of 120 something, you managed to get 60?
Well, I personally did. Many of them were taken out by the organisations themselves through the money that we gave them.
It doesn't mean to say the other 60 remained.
Oh, no. A lot of these were taken out by the organisations themselves through the money that we gave them. The 60 were my own cases.
But in some cases you did not succeed in getting them?
Only one did I fail completely.
Really?
Yes, and that was a child in a convent in Poitiers. But, the fact that I can't guarantee that 100% of the other children were out, but I can guarantee that those that I took out, that I only had one failure. Only one 100% failure. And when I say 100% failure, I lost that child, and there was no way at all that anybody else was going to get to it.
What opposition did you meet in the convents?
Well, you see, I only went once as myself. I usually went in the guise of somebody else.
Meaning what?
Meaning that I would try and find out something in the background of a child, and if possible to sort of have American relatives or things. You see, I was in a position I was in great, I wasn't very safe myself, you must understand. I was in France without a carte d'identité. I had to keep going backwards and forwards to England in order to get a visa again. In 1947 I went to Czechoslovakia. When I came back I had a Czech stamp on my passport. So I stopped at customs at Dover going back to France, and they grilled me for a long time and very, very harshly. The police did, not the customs, the police grilled me. And I mean, I had to justify the fact that I was kept going to France and that I had something to live on. I was always afraid when I walked down the street that somebody would recognise me as being somebody who had sort of been there. I used to walk with my, you know, it was quite traumatic. I think if I'd been any older I couldn't have done it. And I think if I'd had any more sense I couldn't have done it. But I think that when you don't visualise what the consequences of your actions are, and you're sort of prepared at that particular time to take risks, which it obviously was. I mean, you smuggle money and you take risks. You kidnap a child, you take risks. And especially for
now, what you're saying is you went to these various places and in a way you posed as a relation of the child very often, right?
Yeah.
The child was too young to know any different.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, where I thought the child might know any different, I wasn't the relation, I was sent by the relation.
Yes.
For example, I went as a relation, a friend of a family in America, because I knew that it was quite possible that this child might have seen her aunt or her.
Yes. And after then you went there, as it were, you as it were conducted the negotiations with the nuns, whoever it was there.
No, I didn't. No. When I went to the convent, and I must be quite honest about this, and I don't know how honest I can be.
Yes, please.
No, I've been very honest.
And by the way, if there's something afterwards, I'll send it can be erased or marked secret.
What I would do with the
closed.
convent.
Let's get the story.
If I was going to a convent, I never went as myself, obviously. Now, for example, there were 2 children in a convent in Paris. And I had an American friend whom I made as my husband. I changed my whole sort of attitude, learned a bit of, sort of American jargon, and phoned the nuns first and said that I'd come over from America and I'd been asked by the relations of these children, these girls, if I could please take them out for tea. And they said yes, and I took them out for tea. I came and I collected them, and they asked me to have them back in time for supper, and I just didn't take them back. That's all. I took them to one of the children's homes. And the children were quite happy to be there.
Really?
Oh, yes. No, the only time I had any children who wanted to go back to their homes, and I never really knew quite what happened, were 2 girls. One 16 and one 17. They were both engaged, or nearly engaged, and that story's in there too.
Yeah.
And I took them from France then, took them to England in order to get them away from where they were. But when I went to the convents, I never went as myself. I always had a story. I took the children out. I mean, I always knew who to ask for and to say that I was a friend of the families, and I was always very polite, and I come from somewhere or other. And I took the children out because there was no use having a discussion with them. I mean, there was no way. After the first instant, after Poitiers, where I went as myself, and with a boy who was the first cousin of this girl, who had genuine tutelage papers. I mean, we had a case that was open and shut. There was no question about any illegality or anything, or money or what have you. We had papers, we had the girl, we knew where the girl was, we got her as far as the rector's or priest's house, we lost her. Because somebody there kept on telling her that her soul would burn in hell if she went on to us. And as simple as that. I was there when it happened. And she had a fit of hysteria, and in the end, because this was late at night, there wasn't a train till the early hours in the morning, I had to leave. And came back and lost the child. But otherwise, and after that, I learned my lesson. I never went directly. I went, but never as myself.
Were you ever, do you ever find out if they were searching for the child or looking for the child? You never discovered, you never heard of it?
Never discovered, because I never had any repercussions because nobody knew who I was. I mean, nobody knew where to find me, nobody knew who I was. But even the people I was living with didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, but if the nuns had wanted to trace a child with a strict identification registration at that time, they could have traced the child, couldn't they?
They might have been able to, but those children were very quickly, if I thought there was any danger, and I said so, those children were quickly taken to homes, children's homes, and they were lost in the general orphan.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think there's thousands and thousands of orphan children, you're not going to find two. And if you're in Paris and you send a child to a children's home in Toulouse or somewhere, nobody's going to know. I mean, quite honestly, and I think that they wouldn't try too hard because they were holding on to those children really against all principles. How are they going to say they had two Jewish children that they were converting and wouldn't let go back to the Jewish community? They should have given those children up. They should have voluntarily taken those children to the Jewish community and said, we've got two Jewish children here, would you like to have them back? But they didn't. So if they went looking for those children, they were in the wrong. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't worried, because I had if they'd have found me, I would have had a very good thing to say to them. I would say, you stole our children, you give them back to us, you have no right.
Previously there were cases that they had voluntarily returned children?
Oh yes. Yes, children had voluntarily been returned. I don't know how, obviously they must have done, because I know that a lot of children had been hidden in that. I think the children were hidden in bulk. Let's say a dozen children together. They gave up a dozen children. It was the 2s and 3s and 1s, you know. I mean, I think there are quite a few famous French performers who were hidden by nuns or priests and whatnot.
Yes. Have you read, there's a book that you must read. No, a new book by Professor Saul Friedlander.
No, I haven't.
Now, you say that the children went so willingly to these places, even though the conditions in the homes were often, as you said, so appalling?
It's because, you see, the homes may have been appalling, but the children were happy. They had the most wonderful house parents, if you want to call them that. And they had each other. And there was a terrific feeling of camaraderie. I found in the children's homes that younger children look after older children. There was a very great feeling of togetherness. I mean, when you have children with no parents, they have nothing. And that was their family. And I'm sure that they formed great attachments, and they probably kept these attachments. And the people who looked after them. And I know, because I spent practically every weekend in one children's home or another. I used to go there and spend the weekend there, because I felt so happy.
And they hadn't had that feeling in the convent?
The girls of the convent I never spoke. The children who'd been in convents I never saw after I took them out. I told you I was never in contact with any child with whom I had taken up. It was wrong. I didn't want this to have all. I perhaps had enough sense to realise that I was going to have to live with a story, let alone the people. So I remember them as they were when I saw them last, which was when I'd taken them from wherever they were, either in the most appalling conditions or not quite so appalling conditions, but very often appalling conditions, because the people who hung on to these children usually hung on to them purely because of the money that they were bringing in, not because they loved them so much. And also from convents, from which I always had a trauma, you know. And so that was goodbye. And I was very fortunate, really, because when I came home in just before Pesach in March. I met my husband, with whom I'd known since he was my brother's Rosh Hashanah in Helping, so I knew him all my life. And we were married in September of 1948, which was the year that I came back, and my daughter was born in 49. And I think one of the things, and this is a rather an intimate thing, and that is that I made my husband promise that if I couldn't have children I would adopt them, because I could never imagine that after all these children that I had taken that I couldn't have any, that I wouldn't have a family of my own life. I was very, very adamant about, I love children. When I came back, I've been teaching now for 20 odd years, Jewish studies, because I feel that this is the best thing I can possibly impart to the children. And writing for children. In other words, whereas before this experience, I suppose I was like any other student of my generation. Children weren't of any great importance, we weren't very conscious of them. They became I became, it has, I think I really, in a way, I've got a thing, it's given me what do you call it, a hanger on kids, which I don't, which I've had since then, and I suppose I always will have.
Now you mentioned before that some of these people were hanging on to the children for the money that they were getting. Who was paying them?
The government. Like in England, where if you foster a child, the government pays you. If you fostered the children, you were paid by the government. Mm-hmm. And you were paid a pretty, sort of fair amount of money for fostering a child. And if nobody came and collected them, or you didn't want to give the child up, and you didn't have anybody with any official reason why they should give the child up, the child stayed where they were.
You ended your mission for purely personal reasons?
No, I ended my mission when I thought that I'd done all I could. It was February, and by that time things were getting very slow. There was very little doing. I'd done everything I could. I'd organised a search. And by February I really felt that I was de trop and that I could come home, and I asked Rabbi Swift if it was all right if I came home, and I went to the consistoire and I said, look, anything else that can be done, there are people now who, things were beginning to improve anyway. People, if there was anything left to do, they didn't need me anymore.
Who were your contacts in the consistoire?
Rabbi Capel, I think his name. In fact, I'm sure, that's what I can remember, and of course Rabbi Kaplan was there at the time as well.
Were you in touch with him, Rabbi Kaplan?
No, I think Rabbi Capel, C-A-P-P, I think it was Rabbi Capel who gave me my office and who gave me my, got the éclaireur to help me move and do all sorts of things. And when you don't speak a language very well, when you're in a completely strange place, the things that happen to you sort of follow. You're so busy concentrating on trying to adjust yourself that you don't really remember the details. Whereas afterwards, when things are sort of much more clear, you sort of remember things that happen. And afterwards, a long time ago now, it's 31 years ago.
Do you remember how you found the finale boys?
Well, I don't remember. All I know is that the trouble, I'd got them down. I remember going to, I think they'd been moved. Because I remember going, there were two, there was Bert Meisels and there were the finale boys. And I remember going, because I remember them being moved, having to go somewhere else. And then I remember it blew up into a big case, and I remember sort of coming back to England and talking about the case, and I remember the whole thing sort of blowing up in the papers, and I remember some of my feelings when they were they were actually kidnapped in the end, I think, by their uncle and taken away. And I remember sort of feeling such terrific relief that at last they got free, because you resent so terribly the fact that somebody's tried to. It's really like somebody having children. I have 3 children, and I mean I can't possibly imagine. It's beyond one's comprehension. Having to give away one's child in the first place. So on behalf of those who gave their children up in order to save them, I was doing this. You don't do it. You suddenly sort of feel that this is why somehow or other, perhaps I always felt maybe there was somebody somewhere or other sort of saying to this child, it's all right, you can go with her.
Did you report regularly to the consistoire people?
No, I didn't report to people. I went to the consistoire for help. If I needed help, I went to them. What? But I didn't report to anybody in France at all.
Did you keep records?
I kept some records. I kept lists, which I have there. I have lists of children who were, lists of children who were. A lot of lists I didn't. I must say that I had never run an office in my life. I wasn't terribly efficient. I didn't keep half the amount of records that I should have done, because I didn't really, when you're in the middle of something, you don't realise how important it's going to be afterwards. fortunately, I kept those that I did, and I actually was very lucky that I took the only notebooks that I took with me back to France, back to England, because I remember being told off terribly by Diane Grunfeld, because she said to me, "You never write enough, and you never report enough." And I said to him, "I'm sorry, but I've got no time."
Did you write in reports once you were
No,
there?
I used to go back and report. I'd phone him up and speak to him. I usually phone him. I mean, I did write. Apparently, I tried to find anything that was written. But you see, what can you write? Thank you very much, I've received the money. Thank you very much. Sort of, what I was doing, you could only report to him personally. I mean, when I was married, he came from America to marry me. And he gave a resume under the chuppah of the work that I had done in France. On my bridesmaid, he was tagging, I think he spoke for maybe, it was I think 45 or 50 minutes. And I'd fasted and I had a leg. But he decided that it was, that he would, actually they gave me the most beautiful menorah as a Hanukkah, as a present. But, you see, there was nothing, I mean, fortunately, I'd met enough people. There was, I met, I don't know whether you know Ivor Golka.
Never?
Ivor Golka.
G-O-L-K-A.
Ivor Golka. Well, he's the Kibbles representative now in London. His wife was the only English girl I met while I was there, except one other girl who was at the City Universitaire at the time. But other than that, she was at the Maison d'Enfants Jouer en Chaussades. So she is, and I only knew this, I found her this just the last few months. Everything has fallen into place. All the people who were concerned. I mean, I found Yitzhak Michaeli, he's now the consul in France, who actually helped me clear my room in the Rue de la Victoire Synagogue and took me first to Jouer en Chaussades.
What was his position? What was he doing then?
He was a member of the Éclaireur.
I see.
And he came on the Exodus to Israel. And by accident, he didn't go back to Israel on Yom HaAtzmaut. And I happened to, they had got me tickets to go to this concert. And even though I wanted to, I didn't really want to go, I went. And we met at the top of the stairs. And we hadn't seen each other since he went on the Exodus. And I said goodbye. I mean, so I'm very fortunate in the fact that there are people who knew I was there. He, of course, knew what I was doing, even though she did. Well, I think she did actually, because I discussed one or two things with her at the time. But it's made it much easier for me now to literally talk about it, because it's very difficult when you're in a vacuum. But suddenly I'm no longer in a vacuum, because there are people around me who are associated with this particular period of my life, which makes it much easier for me than it ever did.
When you went back to England, you gave a final report then to Dan Grunfeld?
When I came back to England, Dan Grunfeld was in America. I gave a final report to Rabbi Swift, who thought it was incumbent upon him to get me married off because he'd taken 2 years out of my life. So everywhere I went, I found it. And, oh yes, I gave a final report to him, and it was decided that enough. I don't think there's any more money anyway. I don't think there was any funds left. In fact, in a letter that I have here, he tells me that Diane Lazarus will reimburse me for the money that my mother and my parents had given me, because they used to send me money over to France because they knew I was starving most of the time.
You have in touch with Rabbi Goldman here, who was Rabbi Herzog's secretary now?
No, I remember, he was Rabbi Herzog's secretary at the time.
Yes.
Then I must have met him, because I met Rabbi Herzog, I met most of his entourage, because he always seemed to come with an entourage. I don't remember. This is how I.
You met him when he came to Paris?
I met Rabbi Herzog when he came to Paris. I was invited somewhere, and don't ask me where, because I can't remember. But I know that it was in a small room somewhere. I know that I was invited. I know he had a little man around him who sort of did all sorts of things for him, and I was fetched and taken back.
And you told him what you were doing, was that it?
I don't remember. I really don't remember. I remember it happening, because I remember going, and I remember the room, and I remember the whole, and I remember finding it very difficult to understand what was going on at the time. But by that time, of course, I could I could speak French, but most of this was conducted in Yiddish and not in French, which my Yiddish wasn't as good as my French by then. Even though I'd spoken quite a bit of Yiddish when I first came to Britain.
That was your only contact with Rabbi Herzog?
Yeah. I met him in, I was invited to a meeting that he was at in England before I left. And I was invited to a meeting here in France. But, I mean, after all, I must have been a very small cog in it. I don't know, he may remember, or his secretary might remember.
Yes, that's Rabbi Goldman, I was wondering, because he's also been working on...
He might very easily remember, because after all said and done, I was much younger, and he knew what it was in the context of a whole. I only knew what it was in the context of what I was doing, because I'm sure that I wasn't the only agent in France doing what I was doing, but I was the only agent that I knew about doing what I was doing. And I was the only agent that had been sent from England to do what I was doing, because nobody else could.
I see. Fine.
But a lot of the agents, the people who hid these children, took terrific risks. I mean, they didn't save themselves. They took children and hid them, and a lot of them took the children over the Alps into Switzerland as well. So, I mean, when I always feel that I came in the easy time when there was nothing. I mean, what I had to do, there was no danger to my life. But I was so full of admiration. You see, the thing about it for me, I suppose, was the fact that, like you and I, we were all cushioned. We weren't occupied. And if you're not occupied, you have no idea of what occupation is. I mean, I was taken by a doctor whom I got to know in Nice to see the girl who had been his fiancée, who had been tortured by this girl. And it was horrific. I mean, all right, and I had also a very interesting experience. It had nothing to do with these children. I met the Baroness de Rothschild, and she had given her house in Neuilly for young boys, you know, teenagers who had come from the camps. And they were all very bad cases of mental stress and all sorts of things. And I used to go there every week. She used to come and collect me, and I used to go there with her and talk to them. And you know, I could never sort of transfer this sort of the agony, the whole thing over to my friends in England. It was really very hard for me, because after all, with all the war, we had a wonderful life.
So the children that you took out, you really just had a very passing...
I took a solemn... I fell in love with one little boy, which I mentioned there, which was the second child that I took out. And I was heartbroken to part with him. I really was heartbroken. I cried, and it was terrible. It was a trouble. But after that, no.
Most of them, it was just a question of a day or so, was it? Or?
When I was living in the beginning, I used to take them to my... It depended. If I had somewhere to take them straight away, I would meet a social assistant. Say, for example, it was an OSA child or a WITSO child or something. I would meet an assistant social of that organisation and give the child straight into their hands.
Yeah, that's it.
From me to you. I would take, for example, when I took a kid home from the meeting somewhere, I'd take the social assistant with me. I may not even let them come in with me, but I would do my negotiations. But there would always be one somewhere around. Because after all said and done, I wasn't qualified as a social worker. And they would take the child. But there were some cases where the children were in such a bad state, I took them home. And I dressed them, and I bought them clothes, and I took them, and I had their hair cut. Sometimes they were lousy, and I deloused them and things like that, because I didn't want them to go to these homes sort of with nothing, you know. And very often, if I took a child out and I knew that I'd take them with nothing, I took them as they stood, you know. I didn't bother with any question of getting clothes or anything. I wasn't interested. The quicker I got them, the less chance there were of anybody changing their minds. So I used to take them and clothe them, buy them clothes, and sort of enough for them to have something to go wherever they were going, with pyjamas, to, you know, the essentials. And then as soon as they were there, of course, somebody else would see to the rest of them, but just enough so they would have something. because I didn't have enough money or resources to do more than that. But I never let a child go with nothing to a children's.
Because when the child came, he was still, I suppose it was hard to, too early to see the question of their sort of religious identification. They
were in the main, by the time I got them, they were already very near their confirmation, which meant that they were Christians, except that so many of them who talked to them remembered that they were Jewish. There were little things. I mean, these two girls that I had, their father, I think, had been a chazan or some religious, and they remembered quite a bit. They didn't necessarily, they remembered it even though it didn't sort of mean religiously anything to them. They remembered the observance of Shabbat candles and things like that. And somehow or other, these children took very easily to their Jewishness.
Yes, that's what it is.
I never felt, I asked after children, don't think that I just sort of said goodbye to them, I didn't. But I found that in the main, the children very easily and very readily went back to their own environment. It's most peculiar, and I think that that's, I have an idea that in any case is a norm. That children who are, you know, they say you take a child till 7.
Yeah.
Well, any child, I would say take a child till 4. Because I would say that a child from 4 onwards has a feeling of what's going on in its home. I mean, you can check it. We start teaching. I started learning Hebrew when I was 4. So I would say that a child from 4 years or 3.5 to 4 years, as long as they are aware of what's going on around, retains. And of course, if you're taken away from your parents, you hang on memory-wise to the things that, the few things that you can remember. And even in irreligious families, there seems to be something that made them different from the other people. I mean, besides the fact, of course, that they weren't the actual children of their foster parents. Even when they become very staunch Catholics, unless they were sort of, in this particular case, the convent, the child was literally sort of frightened.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to tell a child that a soul's going to burn in hell, well, the child is a girl of 15 or 16 is already very impressionable. She's ready to be a nun. 15 and 16, you know, is the age. I remember being told by my teacher at school, I was very frum as a child, by my French teacher, who was obviously a Catholic, but at that particular age, I don't know when it was, I was asked that they changed our school curriculum around on Fridays so I could walk home from school, you know, before Shabbat. And I remember her talking about these sort of adolescent religious maniacs. So I should think that she sort of knew something about adolescent religious maniacs. And a child of 15, of course, is really an adolescent religious maniac, especially if they've been brought up in a convent. But a child of 11 or 12 who comes up to confirmation is not.
What were the age of most of these children then?
Well, you'll see their age is actually from the lists, because the lists give their date of birth.
Right, yeah. But I think that's a wonderful sort of first survey of the situation. And I'll take this.